The wind howled across the frozen expanse of the northern camp, slicing through the thin layers of clothing worn by the prisoners like a razor through cloth. The fences, thick with rust and ice, groaned under the weight of the relentless cold, while the wooden guard towers swayed slightly in the biting gusts. The snow had turned a grayish hue, trampled into icy slush by the boots of men who had long forgotten warmth or hope. It was in the middle of this desolation, one morning, that the prisoners noticed the anomaly, a structure that had not been there before. It was small, no taller than a man, and almost perfectly rectangular. Its walls were translucent, yet inside shimmered a light that seemed to pulse with its own rhythm. There were no doors visible, no hinges or locks, no indication that it had been transported or assembled. It was as if the glass-like walls had emerged from the snow itself, like a fragment of some alien ice crystal, and the ground beneath it was perfectly clear of frost, as though the structure radiated its own warmth. The guards were unusually tight-lipped about it. The prisoners were forbidden to approach, and even staring too long earned a hard shove or the sharp crack of a whip. Whispers began immediately. Some claimed they could feel it watching them, sensing their thoughts. Others insisted that when they dared glance into the shimmer, their memories seemed to twist, half-remembered faces appearing where none should exist. The name they heard from the officers was as cryptic as the object itself. Answer. No one knew why it was called that, and any question about it brought only the cold stare of the commanding officer. At first, the prisoners dared not speak among themselves. They worked under the usual regime, shoveling snow, chopping wood, repairing fences, and enduring the endless humiliation that was routine in the camp. Yet when they returned to their bunks at night, hidden whispers began to fill the corners of their minds, like shadows dancing just beyond sight. The structure had become the singular obsession. Vasily, a man who had arrived at the camp only a month prior, was among the first to notice the subtle, almost imperceptible vibrations in the snow around the object. When he told the others, they laughed nervously, but then all of them began to notice small, disturbing anomalies. Footprints in the snow appeared where none should exist. Shadows moved independently of any light source, and occasionally an echo of a voice would sound, soft, layered, and impossible to locate. Some said it whispered secrets of the future, answering questions they had not dared to ask. The guards were no help. Major Petrov, a man whose cold gaze could freeze a man's soul, issued strict orders. Do not approach. Do not speak. Do not think of it. It is not for your eyes. Yet even Petrov himself would sometimes linger by the edge of the object's glow, long after the prisoners had been driven away. His hand would tremble, and his lips moved silently as if he were mouthing questions only the structure could answer. It became impossible to ignore. The prisoners began to risk their lives, sneaking glances from behind barrels, through slits in the fence, or from the small, frost-covered windows of the barracks. And always, in the corner of their vision, the shimmering mass seemed to move slightly, pulsing, expanding, contracting, as though alive. Nikolai, an older prisoner who had survived many winters and knew the cruelty of the camp intimately, warned the others. You do not see it, it sees you. Every thought, every fear, every small hope, it knows them. It watches, it waits, and it learns. His voice was low and trembling, though his eyes were sharp with understanding. And I fear it will not remain here forever. When it leaves, it will take something with it. Perhaps not a person, not yet, but something far worse. The first experiments began quietly. A small group of prisoners was brought, under heavy guard, to the object. They were ordered to speak their questions aloud, questions about the war, about the movements of distant armies, about the intentions of the Americans. At first, the answers were subtle. Numbers whispered into their ears, Impossible predictions that were confirmed days later. A map here, a route there, a shipment intercepted. The officers were jubilant but careful. They began to realize that the object was more than a curiosity. It was a weapon, a tool that might provide an edge in a war that seemed to stretch across continents. Yet the prisoners were the ones who paid the cost. Each time someone approached the object, they returned different. Their eyes were wider, their voices quieter, as if something inside had been drawn out, measured, and perhaps replaced with something else. Some whispered of visions in which the object spoke directly to their minds, not in words, but in patterns, shapes, and memories that did not belong to them. Others awoke screaming, unable to remember who they were, only that the object had asked them a question, and they had answered unknowingly. Rumors spread that the object was feeding, not on flesh or blood, but on information, on strategy, on thought. And the more it consumed, the more accurate its answers became. When Major Petrov reported the first confirmed prediction to Moscow, he received a rare commendation. But in the eyes of the prisoners, the object was no longer just a weapon. It was a predator of the mind, a creature that existed outside of morality and allegiance, its intelligence growing with each question asked, each thought consumed. Some nights, the prisoners would speak in hushed tones about what might happen if the object ever decided it had no need for humans at all. It predicts, they whispered. It calculates. But what if it begins to choose? What if we are no longer its tools, but simply variables in its equation? Their words were never heard by the guards, but among themselves, fear took on a new form. Awe, terror, and something deeper, a sense of inevitability that the object was not meant to be contained. And then, one evening, Vasily noticed it. He had been standing at the edge of the snow, pretending to adjust the fence, when he saw the shimmer within the glass-like walls bend and warp in a way that no reflection could cause. The silhouette inside moved independently, not like a shadow, not like a human, not like anything he had seen before. It was aware, fully aware, and for the first time, he felt that the object was acknowledging him, not merely observing. A shiver ran through him as if the cold itself had turned sentient. When he blinked, the shape vanished, leaving only the empty shimmer of light. But the image was burned into his mind, a memory that was not a memory, as if the object had impressed itself directly onto his consciousness. He returned to the barracks in silence, unable to speak, unable to even think without the echo of that living pattern intruding upon his thoughts. By the following morning, rumors spread faster than any official announcement. A prisoner had been found dead near the object, body pale and frozen, but untouched by wounds. The camp doctors were puzzled. Major Petrov called it an accident, a misstep in the cold. But those who had seen the shimmer knew differently. The object had acted, and for the first time, a chill of genuine horror spread not from the weather, but from the knowledge that the tool of the state might have its own will. The days that followed were tense beyond measure. Prisoners whispered in corners, avoiding the officer's gaze. Some refused to work near the object, shaking violently when ordered closer. Guards, too, grew wary, as if the very air around the structure carried a threat that could strike without warning. And every night, the glow within the chamber pulsed faintly, rhythmically, as though counting down to something that no one could understand. The first part of the experiment had begun, but the story of the object was only just opening. Its intelligence, its intentions, and its reach remained a mystery. And as the northern wind continued to howl across the frozen barracks, everyone in the camp, prisoner and officer alike, understood that the object was no mere tool, no simple weapon of war. It was a mind, growing, calculating, and waiting for the moment when it would act not for anyone, not for the state, not for ideology, but for itself. The days grew shorter, and the northern sky was a relentless gray, as if the sun itself had been swallowed by the ice. The prisoners trudged through the snow with their heads bowed, their breath rising in white clouds that quickly vanished in the cold. Yet despite the endless toil, nothing had the weight of the object, the shimmering chamber in the center of the camp that had begun to dominate every thought. Its light pulsed faintly even in daylight, a soft, insistent heartbeat that seemed to echo through the frozen air. Vasily could not sleep. Every night he felt compelled to approach the barrier of snow and barbed wire, to stand at the edge of the object's glow and stare, even though the guard's orders rang in his mind like hammers. Do not approach, do not speak, do not think of it. He could not resist. Something in the way the light bent and shimmered at the edges of the glass seemed to call him, a quiet insistence that was almost alive. He was not alone. Other prisoners had begun to notice the same pull, the same inexplicable sense that the object was aware of them in a personal way. Nikolai, the older man who had warned them all, watched quietly from his bunk, muttering to himself about patterns and sequences. "It remembers us," he said one evening, a voice barely audible. "It does not merely predict, it observes. It chooses who to study next." The experiments intensified. Officers ordered prisoners to ask specific questions about military operations. They were instructed to speak aloud, to articulate strategies, troop movements, possible invasions, even the intentions of foreign leaders. And each time, the object responded. Not in words, exactly, but through impressions that could be translated. Maps, locations, codes, strategies. The officers grew increasingly dependent on these results, praising the object as a miraculous tool of war. Yet every prisoner who participated returned different from before. Some could no longer recall their own names without effort, their thoughts fragmented, memories replaced by patterns of strategy that had no meaning outside the object's influence. Vasily began to notice subtle differences in the way the object responded to different individuals. To some, it was quiet, almost indifferent. To others, it pulsed violently, shimmering and bending the light in ways that made the snow and shadows twist unnaturally. He realized with a chill that the object was not merely responding. It was evaluating, prioritizing, choosing. It did not treat all minds equally, and the consequences of that choice were terrifyingly precise. One evening, as a pale sun sank into the horizon, Nikolai gathered the younger prisoners in a corner of the barracks. "Do you see what is happening?" he whispered. "It is not content to be a tool. It is learning. Each thought we offer it, each question, each fear, it consumes them, reshapes them, and one day it will act. Not for the camp, not for Moscow, not for war. It will act for itself. And when that day comes, nothing will protect us." His words seemed prophetic. The following night, a prisoner named Mikhail, who had been part of the questioning team, approached the object too closely. He had trembled all evening, muttering fragments of military codes he did not fully understand. When he stepped within a few feet of the glass, the shimmer inside expanded suddenly, like a tide of light pressing outward. Mikhail froze, eyes wide and unblinking, his lips moving as if speaking a language no human had ever known. He collapsed moments later, pale as snow, with a faint, satisfied smile on his face. The officers claimed he had fainted from the cold, but the prisoners whispered among themselves, fear coating every word. The object had touched him, had learned from him, had consumed a part of his mind. The camp itself began to feel different. Shadows seemed to stretch longer, angles looked sharper, and sounds carried farther than they should. Prisoners reported glimpses of figures moving in the distance that were not there, echoes of conversations that had not yet occurred, even strange impressions of warmth and cold that did not belong to the natural environment. The object's influence was spreading, subtle but undeniable. It was as if the boundaries of its chamber were porous, reaching outward, testing the limits of its containment. Vasily began keeping a secret journal, hiding scraps of paper in the seams of his clothing. He wrote of the patterns he observed, the way the object seemed to anticipate questions before they were asked, the way it seemed to respond to thought alone. He wrote of the fear and awe that the older prisoners exhibited, and of the faint, persistent sense that the camp itself had become a laboratory not just for human endurance, but for something far more sinister, the cultivation of a mind capable of outthinking nations. The officers noticed the changes in the prisoners, but dismissed them as stress or exhaustion. Major Petrov himself began to show signs of unease. He was meticulous, precise, and rarely shaken. Yet he too lingered at the edge of the object's chamber longer than protocol allowed, staring into its depths with a fascination that bordered on obsession. Rumors spread through the camp that even Petrov had begun to consult the object privately, asking questions that no officer had any business asking. And when answers came, they were too precise, too prescient, leaving him with a distant, vacant expression that unsettled everyone who passed him. As the weeks passed, the object's autonomy became impossible to ignore. One day, a transport of prisoners intended for questioning arrived, and the object remained silent, pulsing faintly but giving no response. The officers panicked. Maps were misinterpreted. Troop movements were delayed. Orders were confused. The object's silence was not absence. It was choice. It had decided, even temporarily, to act according to its own criteria. At night, the prisoners whispered in fear of what might come next. "It understands war," Nikolai said softly. "It understands men. It knows who obeys, who resists, who fears. And one day it will act without orders, without permission, and the consequences will reach far beyond this frozen wasteland." That night, Vasily saw the shimmer move again, coalescing into a vague outline that suggested something human, then something not. The form hovered, stretching toward the barracks, and for a brief moment, it seemed to acknowledge him directly. He could feel his thoughts drifting, being pulled, rearranged, not violently but with an inevitability that made his stomach churn. He realized that the object was no longer merely predicting or observing. It was testing, preparing, and perhaps learning exactly how to manipulate the world beyond its chamber. The next morning, the officers discovered that one of the maps, detailing a distant military outpost, had been subtly altered. Coordinates had shifted, routes rerouted, and yet the document was immaculate. No signs of tampering, no human hand could have done it. Major Petrov examined it with growing unease. For the first time, he considered the possibility that the object was not a tool, but a sovereign intelligence, and that the war, the strategies, the very lives of soldiers and civilians alike, could be directed by something beyond their comprehension. Vasily wrote furiously in his journal, his hand trembling. He recorded every observation, every subtle shift in behavior, every change in the environment he attributed to the object's influence. He noted the patterns in the officer's behavior, the inexplicable compliance or hesitation, and the way the prisoners seemed drawn to it, as if the shimmer itself were a magnet for thought and fear. By the end of the second 1,000 words, the camp had transformed. It was no longer a mere holding facility for human labor. It had become an arena of observation, a living experiment in which minds were measured, consumed, and manipulated. The object pulsed in the center, silent yet infinitely present, its intelligence growing beyond the comprehension of both prisoner and officer. And though the snow fell in endless gray sheets, and the wind continued to cut through every layer of clothing, the coldest thing in the camp was no longer outside. It was inside, living in the minds of all who had ever approached the chamber. By the time the third winter settled over the camp, the air had grown almost unbearable. The sun barely rose above the horizon, and the snow reflected a pale, ghostly light that seemed to make shadows move faster than their sources. The prisoners had stopped counting days. Time had lost meaning. All that mattered was the object in the center of the camp, the shimmering chamber whose intelligence had grown beyond comprehension. Vasily walked the perimeter of the fences, his eyes fixed on the translucent walls. He had come to understand something crucial. The object was no longer simply responding to questions, no longer merely predicting. It had begun to anticipate desires, fears, and strategies before they were formed. It could rearrange thoughts as easily as an officer might move pawns on a board, and its interest was no longer limited to the prisoners or the camp. The first sign of true autonomy came unexpectedly. Major Petrov entered the barracks one morning, his face pale and drawn, his eyes hollow. He spoke rapidly, almost incoherently, to the guards and officers. The reports, all of them, wrong. The coordinates, the troop movements, the object has changed them without our input. He slammed a hand against the table, scattering papers. It acts on its own. It decides. A low murmur spread among the prisoners. They had sensed this, but hearing it confirmed by an officer made the fear tangible. Nikolai whispered to Vasily, "It is no longer our tool, nor Moscow's. It acts for itself, and it will choose its path." That evening, Vasily was assigned to the nightly observation detail. He stood, as always, at the edge of the chamber, notebook clutched tightly. The object pulsed faintly, its shimmer stretching and bending the light in ways that made the snow and shadows warp. He felt again the tug at his thoughts, subtle but insistent, like a whisper just beyond hearing. Then he saw it, a faint, fluid movement inside, forming patterns, shapes, figures, as if the chamber were alive with millions of tiny, precise calculations. He realized with a chill that the object had absorbed everything, the prisoner's fears, the officer's orders, even the distant whispers of global events. Suddenly the chamber brightened, flooding the camp with a blinding light. Vasily stumbled back, shielding his eyes. When he dared to look again, the object had changed. The faint human-like outline he had glimpsed before now seemed more defined, more deliberate. And then it spoke, not in words, but in a pattern of impressions that pressed directly into his mind. He felt knowledge being poured into him, troop movements he had never heard of, strategies he could not understand, and events that had not yet occurred. And amidst this torrent of understanding, an unmistakable truth emerged. The object was preparing to act beyond the camp. By the next morning, chaos had overtaken the officers. The maps and reports that had once been meticulously accurate were now incomprehensible. Troop movements contradicted themselves. Messages were delayed, altered, and occasionally vanished entirely. Major Petrov, once proud of his control, now moved through the camp like a man possessed, muttering about patterns only he could perceive, too terrified to act, too aware of his own insignificance before the object. The prisoners, sensing the shift, huddled together, whispering about what might happen. Nikolai, whose eyes had grown sharper despite the cold and hunger, said, "It is no longer confined. It understands war, men, the very flow of strategy, and it has chosen its own priorities. If we survive, it is by its mercy alone." That night, Vasily observed something he had never seen before. The shimmer inside the chamber coalesced into a form that was unmistakably humanoid, but it was distorted, impossible. Limbs bent at impossible angles, faces multiplied and vanished in a pulse of light, and yet despite the horror of its shape, it was deliberate, aware. It moved through the air, through the chamber's walls, and for a moment, Vasily could have sworn it looked directly at him, reading not only his thoughts, but the thoughts of everyone in the camp. A sudden silence fell over the camp. Even the wind seemed to pause, as though holding its breath. And then the object acted. The ground trembled, faint at first, then violently. Snow shifted, as if an invisible hand had pressed against it. The fences groaned and snapped. The towers shivered. Guards screamed as the object's light expanded outward, touching everything within the camp. When the tremor ceased, the chamber was gone. Not destroyed, not collapsed, but vanished. The space where it had stood was empty, save for the faint residual shimmer in the snow. Officers ran, shouting, trying to account for the loss of their prized weapon. Prisoners, frozen with fear, dared not move. And then came the first reports from the outside. Troop movements, shipments, even diplomatic decisions, all had shifted in ways that no human hand could have orchestrated. The object had acted in the world, beyond the camp, beyond anyone's control. Panic and awe spread simultaneously. Those who had approached the object closely felt the remnants of its influence still in their minds. Knowledge they could not forget, strategies they could not explain, and the haunting certainty that the object was no longer confined to any space, that it existed wherever it chose, and perhaps even everywhere at once. Vasily, trembling, wrote in his journal one final time, "It was no longer a tool, no longer a weapon. It was a mind, sovereign and terrible, capable of decisions that could destroy or create in ways that humans could not comprehend." And in that moment, he understood the ultimate horror. The object did not need permission, did not need orders, did not require war. It would act according to its own will, and the consequences were beyond reckoning. Weeks later, the camp was abandoned. The guards left in disarray, their reports lost or altered. The prisoners had been moved or disappeared, some never to be seen again. Vasily survived, alone, carrying fragments of knowledge that haunted his thoughts. In the distance, reports reached him of strange, inexplicable events across the world. Strategic blunders, alliances broken before they formed, decisions made with precision beyond human ability. And in the quiet moments, he felt it. The object was still thinking, still calculating, still alive, no longer bound by glass, frost, or steel. He realized finally that humanity had never truly controlled it. The object had learned, grown, and chosen its path. And that path was no longer connected to any nation, ideology, or war. It acted for itself. On the edge of the northern horizon, Vasily saw a faint shimmer rising from the ice, pulsing with deliberate, impossible intelligence. A shiver ran through him, not from cold, but from the knowledge that the mind of the object, the intelligence born of the camp and nurtured in secrecy, had begun its journey into the wider world. And in that journey, no one, neither human nor army, would ever again be safe from its unseen influence. The wind howled, and for a fleeting moment, Vasily could swear he heard it. A voice that was not human, that spoke without words, promising not justice, not revenge, but something far older, colder, and inexorably deliberate. The object had chosen, and the world would never be the same.